Welcome, everyone, and hello from Alliance Magazine in London. Welcome to today's discussion. We're going to be joined by speakers throughout the world, as well as you, our friends and colleagues from across the globe. I'm Elika Ruhi, the digital editor at Alliance and the moderator of today's digital event, which is the concluding conversation in a series of discussions that have explored the future of philanthropy in different regions of the world. This was in honor of Alliance's 25th anniversary last year, and we convened 6 expert panels throughout 2021 to dive into philanthropy in Africa, the Arab region, Asia and the Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and North America. Today, we're bringing together voices from those 6 events to host a global conversation. But first, just a few notes for everyone attending today before we start our main event. For our audience, you can go ahead and say hello in our chat, which you should be able to access by clicking on the chat bubble, which for most people I think should appear at the top. We'll be keeping an eye on this throughout the webinar, and if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, make sure to ask them here. You can also join the discussion on Twitter with @AllianceMag and using the hashtag #FutureOfPhilanthropy. So those details appear at the bottom of all the slides in case you forget them. Everyone attending this event today is entitled to a 20% discount on any Alliance subscription using the code EVENT22. As a registered charity, Alliance generates much of our income, but we still rely on generous support to keep bringing you trusted, independent, and expert insight. An Alliance subscription gives you access to exclusive subscriber content, 4 issues of the magazine a year, and free access to all future events. You can find a link to our subscription page in the chat area now, and we'll also be following up by email after this event with the offer and a recording of our discussion today. Now I'd like to introduce our panel. We're delighted to have everyone with us today for a truly global conversation. Joining us from Singapore is Caroline McLaughlin, the Chief Partnerships Officer at the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network. From the United States is Dave Biemesderfer, the Forum President and CEO at United Philanthropy Forum. From Brussels, Delphine Morales joins us as the CEO of the Philanthropy Europe Association. From Egypt, Naila Farouki joins us as the Arab Forum Foundation CEO. Paula Fabiani, the president for the Institute for the Development of Social Investment, joins us from Brazil. And joining us from Africa is Cesar Ngule, the program director at the Kenya Development Community Foundation. We're honored to have all of you with us today, and a special thanks to those of you who are calling in from a time zone where it's very late or very early. So now for the main event. I want to start by handing things over first to Caroline. In our event last year that looked at philanthropy in Asia, something that the panel discussed was how rapidly philanthropy had responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the early days of the health crisis. As we look into the future for Asian philanthropy, what do you think it's learned, and are these lessons that will shape the sector's future in the region?
Thank you so much for having AVPN on the Alliance celebration of 25 years. I think that it's exciting for me to be here representing Asia, but also exciting for me to hear what the other panelists have to say, because I think that what we are seeing is some of the trends and issues that we're seeing in Asia converge, and it'll be really interesting to hear those conversations. What we have seen specifically in Asia, which I think is going to be interesting as we look at trends across, as trends into the future. First of all, let me introduce AVPN. So AVPN is a network of funders. We are headquartered in Singapore. We are 80 people across we have 80 people across the region in 13 different markets. So we're well placed to, I think through and what are the trends that we're seeing. One of the particular trends is around collaborative philanthropy. I think that we are seeing our funders being overwhelmed by the scale of the problem that arose in the pandemic. And I think that where previously some had been quite siloed in the issues or the regions or the countries they have been working, they suddenly saw that these issues were across the region, as well as affecting millions more beneficiaries than they had been before. So we are seeing a trend towards collaborative philanthropy that we think will continue. At AVPN, we have 3 new philanthropic funds that we launched and deployed $3 million in grants last year. And this year, we're launching 3 new ones. So we are not seeing this trend decelerate. In fact, we're seeing it accelerate as people are interested in working with others to deploy funds. I think secondly, what we're seeing is that awareness of cross-cutting issues, that it's very difficult to think through education without thinking about the impact of gender. It's difficult to think about gender without thinking of climate. It's difficult to think of climate without agriculture. And that's actually really important because actually, what we want to see over the next 10 years as we move towards trying to solve for the Sustainable Development Goals, we want to see cross-cutting issues. We want to see people think more systemically and strategically about how they're deploying their philanthropy and their philanthropic grants to support a wider range of issues that are all going towards the same challenges. And finally, I think that there's more, and I think this again is very positive. There's more openness towards unrestricted funding into grantees, and I think that is going to be hopefully a trend that we are certainly encouraging our funders to continue to look at the core operating expenses, to think about how we can support great organizations doing great work in Asia. I think that one of the challenges that we're seeing is how do you do effective M&E on unrestricted funding to grantees? And that's something that we're kind of delving deep into, and hopefully maybe we can kind of work so that we can encourage more unrestricted funding. So thank you. That I think is a kind of neat summary, I think, of the three key trends we're seeing in philanthropy. And thanks again for allowing us on to share.
Thanks, Caroline. Next, I want to hand the floor over to Nayla to speak about philanthropy in the Arab region. So Nayla, something that we spoke about last year on our event, which I think was actually this time a year ago, was the vast extremes of wealth and poverty in the Arab region. So you have some countries there that rank among the wealthiest in the world, contrasted with some that are in the bottom half of the world's wealth index. How are you seeing philanthropy help to bridge this gap in the region?
Great. Thank you so much, Elika, and thank you, Alliance Magazine, again for inviting us to participate in this very key global conversation, and particularly at this very key time. So I'm speaking on behalf of a network of Arab donors and foundations and other organizations working in the philanthropy sector across the Arab region. So it's kind of a broad scope when it looks at this sector. And, in considering what are the opportunities post-COVID, or, what we want to hopefully will be a post-COVID world, I think that, obviously we've seen a very seismic shift in paradigms globally, right? In terms of we work differently today than we've ever done before. We've had to adapt in a way that was, emerging from a kind of crisis. And I think that in the long run, we will be the better for it. But what it's also done is it's kind of forced us all into this sort of reckoning, across different parts of the globe. And so from the vantage point of the Arab region, I see that there have been some issues that kind of float up to the top of the priority list. One of them is the climate crisis. And, that's kind of, again, and I very purposefully call it a crisis because everyone I speak to in the sector speaking around climate has said it's no longer an issue. It's no longer a cause. It's, effectively and dramatically a crisis. And, this climate issue, crisis, whatever it is, hasn't really been very top of mind in any formal way in the Arab region. AFF, the Arab Foundations Forum, just recently relaunched, and we relaunched after a lot of reflection that was maybe forced by the COVID crisis. And it kind of gave us pause to sort of see how were we serving our members, and it affected everything that we did in terms of even the way we looked at ourselves and how we were presented and represented in the region. So we made some very, very drastic changes in the structure of our infrastructure for development institution. So one of the things is that we changed where we were registered, and we changed the kind of organization that we were. We still remain a membership network, but we've completely opened up the criteria for eligibility for institutions to become members at AFF. And part of that was driven by seeing these changes in, globally in these seismic kind of paradigm shifts that have happened. And we wanted to ensure that we were able to serve a broader cross-section of the sector, right? So we've included institutions like research institutions and universities and banks, in addition to individuals who are maybe consultants or are consulting on various issues that affect the sector. So, and part of part of that was wanting for us to be a bit more inclusive as a network. And I keep saying that we wanted to democratize access, to allow for more equitable access to the resources so that we could serve our region and our sector better. AFF is effectively, at this scale, really the only network for and membership association for foundations and organizations that are working in the philanthropic sphere. So it kind of behooves us really to be as inclusive as possible, and in the hopes that this will also encourage the building of more infrastructure for development. So in addition to this climate crisis, coming up as, floating up to the top of the list of priorities, and in many cases, I imagine it's also probably due to the fact that COP27 is going to be hosted back on the African continent after a few years of being hosted elsewhere. It'll be hosted in Egypt. So this kind of, put a lot of us into overdrive, trying to scramble to figure out how can we be a part of this conversation. AFF, as a regional network of organizations, wanting to bring the philanthropy sector's voice to the table. So we've seen an opportunity that allows us to engage on this global issue, and to bring an Arab voice to this conversation. We've also been talking about and hearing conversations about how various actors in the sector, again, given this reckoning of what COVID taught us about ourselves and how it reflected back about ourselves, are seeking to be more purposeful in their programming, with an eye towards creating more effective impact in bridging the gap between the gap in wealth. And so we're seeing an interest in the climate crisis for sure, but also the other issues that are peripheral to it and tangential to it. So, and issues that are actually related and very much interrelated. So issues around mental health, education, and looking at education from a mitigation of crisis viewpoint rather than just kind of a long-term impact. Health in general. So these are kind of the things that have, the conversations that have been happening. These are the conversations we've been having with members that have come back to AFF, because since we've relaunched, we've not only brought back our old members who've been with us, for the last 15 years, but we've also brought in new members that were never part of our network before. Greenpeace MENA, for instance, is one of them. SOS Children's Villages. So all these people who have also looked at themselves and have been seeking a network to join so that they can also contribute to these conversations. So I hope that kind of answers your questions and also gives you a little bit of an insight into where we're headed and what we're thinking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Nayla. Yeah, it's very exciting to hear about these developments at AFF. And something I remember that we spoke about during our Arab panel was the increasing professionalization of the sector there. And I'd be interested to hear a bit later on how that looks in comparison to some of the other regions. But next, I want to turn the floor over to Delphine in Europe. So when we spoke last year about the future of philanthropy in Europe, you highlighted some urgent themes for philanthropy to focus on, like climate change, strengthening democracy, and equity and diversity. So as the head of the newly formed infrastructure body for European philanthropy, what is your vision for helping the sector prioritize these issues?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and very happy to be also here presenting the Philanthropy Europe Association, indeed a short filiale. And I guess many of you will not have heard of us before, which is perfectly normal. As you said, Alicia, we are a brand new organization, but builds on the strong legacy of the European Foundation Center and Daphne, which decided to converge a little over a year ago. So together we bring to the fore a group of 250 foundations and 29 national associations, which in turn represent 10,000 foundations. And I guess Philae has really been built against the backdrop of a global crisis and rapidly changing landscape. So I wanted to start maybe by highlighting a couple of trends which we've observed from our membership and which have led us to move towards the creation of Philae as we have it today. And I should probably start by saying that, of course, the philanthropic sector in Europe is extremely diverse, with 147,000 foundations operating across the continent. But this being said, I think there are a couple of red threads which resonate really well with what we've heard with Caroline and Naila, and that we've also observed within Europe. So first interesting point has been to me around how foundations indeed started to collaborate more with each other, but also very importantly with their grantees, operating more and more on the basis of trust. And in some cases, this stronger donor-grantee relationship really led to a revision and refocus of the way of working of foundations, allowing them to respond to the challenging and changing needs of their beneficiaries. And with this, we also saw a rise in participatory grant making, with some of our foundations really transforming into fully participatory organizations, and others, for instance, deciding to bring beneficiaries on board in their own reflections and governance and programs. And I guess a clear example of that is the move we're seeing more and more towards child and youth participation, based on the understanding that real change doesn't happen overnight. It's not a short-term thing, and we need to involve those who will be leading the future from the onset. So that's, I think, an interesting challenge or an interesting development that also resonates with what Caroline was saying. And then at the same time, we're also seeing a renewed desire from philanthropic organizations to collaborate with authorities. And within the EU, or at the EU level in particular, there is an increasing role of the recognition of philanthropy and the role that we can play in building back better, which is quite encouraging. Also important is the continued reflection around globalization that is very much at the fore of our discussions, with on the one hand a growth of community philanthropy and local solidarity very much at the onset of the crisis, and on the other hand we saw from a survey that we did with our members recently that they increasingly also want to work cross-border and internationally based on a vision of one planet, one health, and that keen understanding that came from the crisis. And that last but not least, I think it's also important to mention that we're observing a tendency for foundations to become more conscious about investments of their endowments, and also willing to increase mission-related investments, which I expect to be a growing trend also in the years to come. So with that kind of changing landscape of the past year, it really comes as no surprise that the European Foundation Centre in Daphne wanted to also change the way infrastructure is organized in Europe. And that led to the creation of Philia. And indeed, as you mentioned, we asked our members before we launched to have an understanding of what the key societal issues were that they would like us to focus on. And the three topics that came up were the climate crisis, raised already by Nyla, polarization and how it undermines our democratic systems, and setbacks in achieving an agenda which really leaves no one behind. So in response to the demands of our members, we will have climate, democracy and inequality very much as cross-cutting themes across the work of Philia. And as was mentioned again by Caroline, doing that in a way that approaches the problems from a comprehensive and intersectional approach, and very much also in partnership with other players from the ecosystem. So we will seek to provide richer opportunities for our members and for stakeholders to build knowledge, to learn, to connect, to enable philanthropy, and to anticipate trends that really require our collective investment and our collective imagination. And we do that based also on an understanding that the challenges of our time are just too big to be dealt with by any sector alone. And that the landscape of philanthropy as such is becoming more fluid, and that we have a unique value to play within that context that requires us to be catalytic, to take risks, and to think longer term. So that's a little bit where we stand in terms of what we see, and hopefully that responds to your question.
Thanks, Delphine. Yeah, we're looking forward, I think, to seeing what Philia will help push European philanthropy towards, and I think that it's an exciting moment to sort of think about the future and what we should really prioritize, because there's a lot. So next I'm going to turn the floor over to Paula in Brazil. So last April, you joined us for a discussion about the future of philanthropy in Latin America and highlighted a few key trends that were emerging in the region's giving. And that included things like an increase in technology, a rise in community philanthropy, and the emergence of new mechanisms for giving like blended finance and venture philanthropy. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen these develop in the time since we last spoke?
Thank you very much, Elika, and thank you, Alliance, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here and see so many friends like Nyla and others in the audience that are really people that contribute to my journey. So as you mentioned, technology has come to stay, and that has really impacted civil society in the philanthropic sector. we see much more concern with generating and using data. And impact evaluation has really got to very large philanthropic organizations and companies. Private sector is also very worried about measuring the impact and using the philanthropic capital in a more efficient way. Another thing that you mentioned are the new mechanisms. We have no borders anymore between philanthropy, venture philanthropy, and blended finance and other mechanisms to create social and environmental impact. I think, as Caroline mentioned already, this is something that is increasing in Latin America. I'm also part of Latin Pacto, which is the venture philanthropy network for Latin America. And we see that the ESG agenda, the environmental, social, and governance, is also helping to bring more companies into a philanthropic journey, especially for the S, the social, which is good news. And in that regard, we see much more collaboration in the sector. So we have seen with the COVID movements like the United for Vaccines, which was led by business people, but involved the philanthropic sector, the companies, to help the governments, municipalities, to vaccinate as much people as possible. So providing all the infrastructure, because the federal government would only send vaccines. And we see that in other areas, like the SDGs, that was also mentioned already. The Catalyst movement has also a Brazilian chapter, the Catalyst, which is a movement of social entrepreneurs to accelerate the achievement of the sustainable development goals. We have a pact for racial equity that started here in Brazil, involving companies and the philanthropic sector and civil society organizations, which is really interesting collaboration movement. The Coalition for the Climate, led by Wings, and we have in Brazil specifically lots of coalitions emerging for the climate change challenge, which is really big, and also to promote a culture of giving in the country. Moreover, you also mentioned the community philanthropy engagement in Latin America. We have seen growth in community philanthropy organizations in Mexico, and now in Brazil we also have much more interest in the topic and very different models for that, but it's something that can really help solve local problems and emerge local philanthropy. I would also like to mention there is more grant making, which is good news. We see more companies and philanthropic organizations worried about strengthening civil society organizations. I'm also part of the CAF, Charity Aid Foundation International Network, and there's a lot of movement in terms of bringing capital, money to the civil society organizations, but not for projects, but strengthening the organizations themselves, which is very important for the sector. And just to finalize, I would also like to mention that some, as Naila mentioned, some cross topics that there are really, our philanthropic sector is really worried. Education, we went 10 years backwards in our education public system. It's a big challenge, and maybe technology can be very important on that regard. Democracy, I cannot even say much more about that, but it's a very polarization, and it's a big topic here in Brazil, and we see more philanthropists interested in financing such initiatives. Diversity, and finally, which is a COVID result, income generation. We have much more vulnerable people now, homeless people, more homeless people in the streets, and people unemployed, and this becomes also a topic of interest in our philanthropic sector.
Thank you, Paula. It's really exciting to hear about all of these developments in Latin America, and I hope that we can come back to some of these things a bit later in our discussion. But for now, I want to hand things over to Dave, who's joining us from the US. Good morning, Dave, and thanks for joining us. During
Good
our
morning.
panel, yeah, good morning. During our panel discussion last year, which we talked about the US and Canada, we asked whether American philanthropy was suffering an existential crisis or a moment of opportunity. And I'd like to revisit that question with you here today.
Great. Thank you, Elika, and congratulations to Alliance for your 25th anniversary. I'm pleased to be sharing some of my thoughts today on the future of philanthropy, specifically focused on the United States. The United Philanthropy Forum, for those who may not know about us, is a network of 95 regional and national philanthropy associations and networks, representing more than 7,000 funders. So after all that has transpired in our country and our world over the past 2 years, I feel more unqualified and uncertain than ever in making any solid predictions about what the future holds for philanthropy. However, I did want to share with you 6 key questions, and the answers to these questions, I think, will help determine what philanthropy will look like in the future in our country. For example, will funders make permanent some of the changes in grant-making practices that they've instituted during the pandemic? And will more funders follow suit? At the start of the pandemic, more than 800 funders signed a pledge committing to many of the grant-making practices that are part of the trust-based philanthropy principles, such as giving more multi-year general operating support, streamlining application and reporting processes, engaging in authentic listening with grantee partners to inform a funder's strategy and approach, and more. Will this trend continue and grow, or will funders default back to more traditional ways of working, such as relying more on project support, requiring nonprofits to go through big hurdles to apply and report on a grant, and the like? Another question: over the past 2 years, amid a pandemic that revealed the deep inequities in our country and made growing calls for racial reckoning across the country, a number of funders have made public commitments to support more organizations and more movements working to advance racial equity and racial justice, including more support for organizations led by people of color. Will these commitments continue, and will more funders join in? Or will the field move on to the next trend? And will funders match their public commitments to support racial equity and racial justice with internal commitments to ensure that they are operating as equitable organizations, embedding principles of racial equity in their internal work, including their decision-making processes, how power is wielded in the foundation, how a foundation's board operates, and more? My third question: will we see more high net worth donors consider less traditional methods for using their wealth to benefit communities? For example, will more donors go down the path of philanthropists Mackenzie Scott and Dan Jewett, who have not only pledged to give away the bulk of their fortune during their lifetimes, who have demonstrated a tremendous level of trust in the nonprofit organizations they have funded, providing significant grants with no restrictions on when and how they must use the funds and with minimal reporting requirements? And will more donors of more modest means engage in philanthropy through vehicles like giving circles, which continue to grow in our country? Another question: will our sector be proactive to get behind some modest legislative or regulatory proposals to ensure the public that charitable funds are being used appropriately and in a timely manner to benefit communities? For example, can the sector get behind proposals for community foundations to report on inactive funds, or for an aggregate DAF annual distribution requirement, which are 2 proposals that came out recently from the Council on Foundations? Or can the sector support a proposal to use the private foundation excise tax to incentivize private foundations to increase their payout? Or will the sector resist all so-called reform proposals and run the risk of legislation or regulation that is not informed by data or by our field, and that could be harmful to giving? Question: can philanthropy in our country step up in a big way to confront our global climate crisis? And yes, it is a crisis. There are a number of US funders that have committed significant resources to climate change and climate justice. But is philanthropy's commitment to this issue commensurate with the scale of the crisis? Can more funders determine how they can bring a climate lens to their grant making, no matter the issues they fund? And can they bring that lens to their investments as well? Finally, can more funders commit not just their dollars, but their voice to defending and strengthening democracy in our country? will philanthropy step up in a big way to ensure, for example, that everyone can vote freely and fairly, and to engage actively in broader civic engagement efforts in our country? Depending on the answers to these questions, philanthropy might look and behave quite differently than it does today in the United States, or it could be very much the same. I look forward to engaging with the members of the United Philanthropy Forum and our broader network to create the best path forward for our sector and our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I think those are all really important questions, and maybe we can take a stab at answering a few of them a bit later on. But for now, I want to hand things over to our last panelist, Caesar, who's joining us today from Kenya. Last year, we spoke about the growing middle class on Africa's continent and how that is impacting the region's philanthropy. Can you talk a little bit more about that today? What do you think that we'll see from African philanthropy over the next decade?
Yeah, thank you, and I greet everyone. And probably I can begin with a few points, then I will wrap up with the emerging middle class. And so I want to agree with the previous speakers, especially on emerging corporate sector, especially environment, governance, and social reporting. It's opening a lot of doors for philanthropy, especially in the area of environment. More investment from corporates are coming up. We are also seeing a lot of competition among the corporate sector, and competition in the sense of every other investor in philanthropy wanting impact. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that you have more people beginning to consciously listen to what communities want, so that then there's more guarantee on the final outcome. We're also seeing a lot of secrecy in giving being eliminated, and so pioneers of philanthropy in Kenya, like guys like Manu Chandaria, must be smiling, because a lot of high net worth individuals are beginning to come out to give openly, and without a lot of fears for being called that you are money laundering and things of that nature. And also a lot of investments are also being done around legislative agenda to ensure that the people can get rebates if they give, but also to ensure that there's more controls on money that could be linked to terror and other issues. And so that is making people who have resources a little bit easy about giving. There's also the question of emerging solidarity that we saw during COVID period. So I think the momentum has not been lost. There's more when Kenyans are giving, and generally people are beginning to follow through and to demand for more horizontal accountability after giving. And I think that is very healthy for the sector, especially as we move into the next era. There's also because of in the era of conversations around localization, there's been a lot of investment in the capacity of organizations to uptake, and so there's also increasing demand to engage with philanthropists, so that then people don't become only vehicles of projects. And so I'm seeing more organizations negotiating better, trying to negotiate for a little bit more of institutional support and not just what the project. A lot of terms, words like co-creation become very common. And even when you go to grassroots organizations, because like KCDF, we also do a bit of grant making, communities are demanding for co-creation and being involved. And I think that's a good thing, especially for the sector. And lastly, there's also a lot of people who have been giving, and especially corporates and philanthropists. There's also now a growing appreciation. A lot of organizations were being shadowed by bigger organizations that had bigger systems to implement programs, but now there's a growing sense, and I think this is going to shape the future of people and corporates beginning to realize the critical role of communities, and especially when they look at working with a corporate or an investor working directly with communities, or the value add that community-host organizations play in ensuring quality. I would say the middle class is maturing in Kenya. there's an increasing sense of because we are moving into a generation that is engaging, that they are beginning small SMEs. There's more wealth in the pockets, and people are looking for more organized ways of giving. And so when you look at even at an organizational level, you still see a steady growth of income levels that we are getting from individuals. The only thing is that they're also demanding to be involved. So if, for example, they're supporting a child to access education, they want to make follow-up, they want to connect and such things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cesar. It's interesting to hear these reflections on African philanthropy. Thank you to all of our panelists who have spoken so far today. We're going to now turn to a Q&A, but before that, I want to direct a poll question to our audience. So the poll question, you should see it in the center of your screen, but if you don't see it there, check the chat thread and you should be able to access the poll question. And the question is, what do you think global philanthropy should prioritize funding over the next decade? And the responses are health, economic inclusion, social justice and democracy, climate and environment, racial justice efforts, or other. And if you select other, please let us know in the chat what you're thinking about. So we're going to leave the poll question open for everyone to have a chance to answer it. And we're now going to open it up to a Q&A. So just a reminder to everyone that if you have a question for our panel, go ahead and share it in the chat and we'll do our best to address it today depending on time. So I actually want to take a question that was asked by Liz McKeon in the chat, and it's for Nayla. So with the focus of COP27 shifting this year to Egypt, what do you see as the most impactful ways that climate funders can drive positive outcomes?
So I saw this question in the chat, so I had a couple of minutes to think about it to see how I would respond. And one of the things is to say, you know, when I heard that COP27 was coming to Egypt about 3 weeks before everybody else did. And the reason I heard that is because the UN high-level champion for climate from the UK government was coming on a kind of, you know, under the radar trip to Egypt, because he had obviously advanced information and he knew, you know, ahead of time that this was the most likely outcome. So he came to do kind of like a reconnaissance and figure out, you know, who were the players. And he was interested, obviously, in meeting, he and his team were interested in meeting both private sector, public sector, government, you know, government representatives. They were totally hooked up with the government, no problem. You know, they had a couple of hours to meet with some private sector individuals, but they came to AFF to see who from the philanthropy sector that they could talk to. And I had maybe 2 weeks notice to kind of put together a little bit of a meet and greet. You know, I hosted a low-key dinner for them. And other than Greenpeace MENA, and, you know, I scouted my entire network in Egypt, there was nobody else in the philanthropy sector working on climate as a focus. And Greenpeace is not an Arab organization, it's an international NGO with, you know, with a MENA-based office. So that, you know, it was a bit of an eye opener, and that's why I think at one point I said earlier when I was speaking to say that, you know, now that the COP is coming back to Africa, we're all like, oh, we better really get it together by November. So we started very quickly as a network talking to not only Greenpeace MENA, who is now one of our members at AFF, but then just kind of, you know, talking to the rest of our membership and saying, do you have an interest in this climate crisis? Is it something that's even on your agenda? And, you know, so overwhelmingly it is. So what we're trying to do now is try to figure out how we can gear the conversation in a way that allows us to come to the November COP27 with either recommendations from the sector to our governments and to world governments about how we can empower mitigations and interventions from all different regions, but specifically from the Africa region, towards you know, improving and contributing to this climate crisis in a positive way. That's one thing. And then the other thing is really to emphasize not only the importance of these kinds of networks, because again, like when I think about it, the UN, the UN champion for high-level champion for climate would not have had anyone to speak to if there hadn't been an AFF on the ground. And the only information they would have gotten and the only interaction they would have had would have been with government and potentially some private sector players. So it highlights really the importance of these networks and what these networks can bring to the table, and then B, also what these networks can bring in terms of the voice of the sector to the table and how we can help galvanize some kind of support and some coordinated response. So encouraging these collaborations, which everyone on this panel has talked about, and which was further kind of elaborated as a priority coming out of this COVID crisis, or still in the middle of it, who knows.
Thanks, Nayla. I think it's very interesting to think about the role of the infrastructure networks when it comes to these like cross-sector summits that are now dealing with some of the most important crises of our time. But actually connected to that, I want to now look at the results of our poll. So 45% of our attendees today say that climate and environment is what global philanthropy should prioritize funding over the next decade. And following that, social justice and democracy has 22%, economic inclusion 15%, racial justice efforts 6%, and health is 2%. And some other people did say other, and I've been seeing some responses in the chat. I just want to invite all of our speakers to open their videos now for the rest of the hour, if that's okay. And our next question I'm going to address to Delphine. So this question is from Arla Gruda, and she asks, can you elaborate more on the willingness of foundations to work and invest more internationally?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. So this is based on a survey that we did with our membership ahead of our conference that took place in October, where we asked them, are you planning to do more international work in 2022? And we saw that over half of them said that they would. And we also asked them how they would be planning to do that. They would be planning to do that by forging collaboration with international partners, by sharing best practices from other countries, and by being part of communities such as ones that we host, whereby you learn together. And the reason why they want to increase cross-border collaboration and have that kind of international scope is because of a keen awareness of the complexity of the problems that society faces today, and an understanding that global challenges really require us to work locally in collaboration across regions and across sectors. So that came very much to the fore in the responses that we got from our members. And with that also an understanding that politics are changing also in terms of external policies of the EU, which was presented as one of the reasons to do it. Also, the COVID pandemic as such really led to a clearer understanding that collaboration is needed, and kind of an understanding that if we want everyone to be healthy, we really need to focus on providing that space, and a requirement also from us to become more systemic in our approaches, so that we would be able to respond more collectively to the problems. Another reason that was given by some of our members was around democratic recession and the need to work collaboratively across borders to react to authoritarian regimes. And with that also the need to have more solidarity between North, South, but also among certain groups, to really support where certain communities are under pressure. And then the last reason that was given was also around the relevance organizationally of the work of the philanthropic entities that we represent. So a desire to be strategically relevant, and for that reason also wanting to have that international collaboration and that working across border. So that's a little bit what we got from that.
Thanks, Delphine. For our next question, I've seen a couple comments come through about closing space for civil society, and I'd actually like to address this question to Paula, but then I'd be interested to hear what, Caroline, maybe what you have to say. So this question came from Nishit in India, who says, over the past few years, we have seen an increase of control by the government on nonprofit funding, prevention of international funding via stringent Foreign Currency Regulation Act, and other controls that have had a negative impact on the sector's funding. How has such control changed in different parts of the world? So I know this has also been happening in Latin America, and I'd be interested to hear your reflections on this question.
Yes, you're right, Elika, especially when we're talking about human rights organizations. They're suffering from government restrictions, increase of compliance requirements, and all kinds of excuses to find problems in such organizations. And in Brazil specifically, we have seen that trend also with the environmental organizations. The government polemizing the action of some organizations, sometimes even with non-factual facts, I mean, with fake news. And this is damaging dramatically the sector and also our capability of attracting international funders, because there is a lot of suspicion and sometimes fear. On the other hand, what happened was that because the government is not really pro in certain areas, some international funders have been trying to bring more money so that our civil society organizations in these areas, they can sustain their activities and can also strengthen their voices to combat such practices. What we see that is also important is the emergence of the voice of companies. There is, for example, one coalition of agricultural companies, which is, they were actually the bad guys in the climate sector for a long time, and they are making a lot of pressure on the government because it's very bad for the exports, for their businesses. And I think this is something that this last years have brought to the private sector, that it's their responsibility as well to take care of civil society, to take care of the democratic space, because otherwise this is going to be bad for business. And sometimes in more authoritarian regimes, business have to leave the country. And that starts with the NGOs, but that can get to some business as well, because it hinders the business, the market space for companies to operate. So we see that this is something, it's good news that the companies are having more voice and addressing issues like immigration, for example. It's another topic, and we have seen that a lot in the US. Some companies position themselves against bad immigration policies, and but it's a concern. And I go back to the topic of collaboration. We need to collaborate and maybe be behind our logos and our brands, but create movements in society, because this is the strongest way to combat such trends.
Thank you, Paula. Caroline, I want to turn to you on the same subject. So Nasra from Giving Tuesday says, civil society spaces are closing around the world. What insights are your organizations taking to help support CSOs who are coming under harsh government?
I think so. Asia is a vast region, and I think that, you know, we see particularly huge challenges. The FCRA Act, which has limited the ability for nonprofits in India to accept donations from international organizations unless they have an FCRA status, has had a huge impact on the civil society in India. And, you know, in China, we are often asked by our members about supporting nonprofits in China. It is very challenging for foreign money to come into China. I think what we see and what we are trying to promote within our membership network is a focus on continuing to support where you can, to support lobbying and advocacy, to support infrastructure development, because I think that, you know, I saw one of the questions about multi-sector partnerships, and I think one of the biggest advantages of a multi-sector partnership is actually bringing government into the conversation, and government seeing that actually civil society, philanthropy, impact investing, intermediary organizations can be the answer to the solution and can actually support their work. So I think that we continue to encourage people to support infrastructure and to support ecosystem development, because I think that's one way you can change the conversation, because on an individual basis, it is really difficult.
Thanks, Caroline. This next question I want to address to Caesar. So this is something that came up last year during Alliance's 25th anniversary activities. So in our 100th issue, which came out in September, we did a survey of all of our readers and we asked them what foundations have had the most impact. And the results we got were very Western oriented. So the top ranking foundations in our survey were the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Open Society Foundations, along those lines. And I was wondering if you could add to this list, what foundations outside of Europe and North America do you think have had the most impact on the last several decades?
Outside of?
Sorry, are you able to hear us, Caesar?
Yes, the last part, outside of.
Oh, outside of Europe and North America, what foundations would you add to this list of foundations who have had a great impact on the sector and on the way we practice giving, things like that?
No, really, I think it's true, and probably it's because some of the bigger foundations have the resources, and so probably they have in terms of impact or in terms of reach, they are wider. But probably that is calling to question the way we collect such information, because I know in countries like Kenya, you have got very many foundations and other actors who are doing great work, I mean, including ourselves. But just to answer your question, for me, I would look at it from a perspective of foundations that are also beginning to change practice. Currently, I know organizations like the Mod Foundation and the Ford Foundation are beginning to invest in growing institutions, and for me, that's a plus, because they are beginning to appreciate, and there are many others out there. They're beginning to appreciate the centrality of a stronger civil society organization that can be resilient beyond the impacts that the projects cause. So that's how I would look at it.
Thanks, Caesar. I want to address the next question to Dave. Give me just 1 second. I had noted it down. So this question comes from Anna Hirsch Holland, and she says, there has been mention of increasing collaboration between donors and foundations and a recognition of interconnectedness of issues that philanthropy is trying to address. Do you see an appetite and potential for foundations to support or spearhead multi-sector partnerships for addressing complex sustainable development challenges?
Yeah, I certainly see that appetite growing. I think that, as mentioned earlier by Caroline, I think that the philanthropy infrastructure groups represented in our network are vital players in bringing those cross-sector partnerships together, setting that table, and more of our members are doing that today, and there's more appetite for that. And there's also, you mentioned donor, I mean, there's also much more appetite that are represented by a lot of our members and the individual donor community. So we see much more trying to create collaborations along those lines as well, to address the complex problems, bringing in government and business, bringing nonprofit partners to the table to try to move forward on these critical issues.
Thanks, Dave. We just have a couple minutes left today, so I want to open this last question up to any of you, really, who have reflections to share. So Stephanie Simpson says in the chat, what about young influencers' initiatives to fundraise with their community? Is it a growing trend, and is it safe for NGOs? And she's put a link to a UNHCR fundraiser where somebody is a gamer content making for a live stream, and they raised $1 million. So yeah, just reflections on really like where Gen Z and youth are, like at the front of the future of philanthropy.
I can jump in because we've actually received some support from City Foundation, who is very focused on this. And, you know, in our region, like I'm sure in everyone's region, we have, millions of jobs that have been lost in tourism that have traditionally been taken up by youth. The challenges of school and education, and where do these youth go? Where is the livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods? So, one of the things that we are trying to do is to bring the voice of youth into the discussion. I think that, the mentoring piece is super important here as well. Like, how do you engage youth to understand better what their needs are, but then how do you help them articulate that in a framework for the more traditional funders? Because, I'm jealous that someone could make $1 million. Maybe I should look into video gaming to see whether we can raise some funds. But, I think it's about the money, the traditional funding for these issues is in the bigger infrastructure grants, and it is with the foundation. So how do you support them to, how do you support that work and that funding?
Thank you, Caroline. Does anyone else want to jump in on this question? Naila?
Yeah, I just to add to look up Mr. Beast on Google, because this is a 23-year-old philanthropist who has, I think, something like, I don't know how many millions of followers, and this kid just gives away money, just gives away Maseratis and Lamborghinis and money, and has this appeal. No, seriously, I mean, it's beyond anything. I thought my nephew was kidding, and then I looked it up and I was like, oh my God, this guy's doing better than all of us combined. In just energizing this kind of giving. And I think what that illustrates really more than anything, I mean, all joking aside, is just the accessibility of how accessible it can be, right? So this idea that it has to live in some big ivory tower and you have to be this super, super rich person to be able to somehow make a positive impact is a very outdated notion. And as it should be, because the idea is at the end of the day that I'm not interested in conversations that look at how elitist philanthropy can become, and how we can make safe spaces for billionaires, because in fact, if anything, I'd like to make it a lot less safe. And really, I mean, I don't mean that pejoratively, but I just mean, that at the end of the day, the idea really is that every single person can make some kind of an impact. And yeah, we should be encouraging that somehow and encouraging that kind of access. So look up Mr. Beast, because we should all aspire to be like a Mr. Beast.
Someone has helpfully shared the link to his Wikipedia page in the chat. I think there's time for one more comment if somebody else wants to add anything to this.
Yeah, maybe I can come in briefly. I mean, it's an interesting discussion. And for us, I think as philanthropy organizations, it's interesting to think about how youth can also be involved in whatever we do, no matter how we are set up. And we're now within Philia doing a mapping of how youth and child participation is growing as a trend within philanthropic organizations. And we're hoping to be able to also share best practices within our network so that we can learn from that. And with that, we're planning ahead of our conference, which will take place end of May, beginning of June in Barcelona, to also have youth mainstreamed across the work that we do, because we know that we need to be challenged. We need to think differently and think out of the box. And we very much also know that if we want to achieve a 2030 agenda, and if we want to change the world for tomorrow, we need to involve those who are actually leading tomorrow into the conversation today, because without them, we're not going to get anywhere. And the change that we'll be putting into motion might not correspond to what they have in mind. So I think we need to really take that on board, embrace new ideas of young people in the philanthropic sector, and think of how we can learn from them. So that's very much also part of what we're thinking about within Philia.
Thank you, Delphine. I think that's all the time we have for today. So for anyone who's joined our conversation and wants to hear more on all of these subjects, just a reminder, this is the last in a series of discussions like this that we held over the course of the last year. So if you want to hear the recordings of the ones that we held before, you can find them on alliancemagazine.org. I hope you've all enjoyed today's discussion, and if you found it helpful and engaging, don't forget that you can subscribe to Alliance with the code EVENT22. Don't worry if you missed the offer during our event today. We're going to be sending out emails to you shortly with the discount code to get you started, and we're also going to be sending around a recording of this digital event to everyone who registered. So I'd like to end today by saying thank you to all of our panelists who joined us, Nayla, Caroline, Delphine, Dave, Caesar, and Paula. Thank you to the Alliance team, and in particular, our marketing, advertising, and events manager, Anne-Marie McQueen, who has produced today's event. And thank you to everyone who joined today for being part of the Alliance community. Our next digital event is on March 8th, and it will explore mental health philanthropy alongside our upcoming issue on the same subject, which comes out next month. And thank you everyone for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.